I should tell you first that my brother Cade has never in his life done anything quickly. He deliberated over his cravats. He studied the grain of a dining table before he chose a chair. He was the sort of man who would stand at the window of Thornville Hall watching the snow fall for a full quarter of an hour before he'd consent to call it a blizzard. So when Grandmother Marin announced in the second week of January that she had found him a wife, the rest of us, his valet, his steward, and I knew at once that the entertainment ahead of us would be slow, magnificent, and entirely worth watching. What none of us expected was the girl. I will start at the beginning, because Grandmother would insist on it, and because the beginning is the part that sounds like a comedy before you understand it, is the most earnest love story I have ever been permitted to witness close enough to feel the warmth of it. It was the 14th of January, and the Highland road that wound up through the pines toward Thornville was entirely buried. 3 feet of new snow had come down in 2 days, and the road agents had given it up. Cade and I had arrived from Edinburgh a week before, he to review the estate accounts and make decisions he'd been postponing since autumn. Because I had no better place to be, and because Grandmother always set a better table in winter. Thornville itself was the old ancestral seat of the Dukes of Thornville, which is to say my brother's house and not mine, a matter I had long since made my peace with. It sat on a rise above a frozen loch, with pine forest on 3 sides and a view south on the 4th that on clear days would have made a painter weep. On the 14th of January it was not clear. It was white, and still, and very cold, and we were very thoroughly snowbound. Grandmother arrived at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I say arrived, she had been there all season, because Thornville in winter was, in her opinion, the only sensible place to be, and also because she liked to inventory the silver when Cade was not present to object. She appeared in the library doorway while Cade was reading estate papers and I was staring at the fire pretending to read a pamphlet, and she said, without preliminary, "There is a young woman in the East Servants' Corridor. Her coach lost a wheel on the lower pass this morning. The coachman walked to Glenrowan for help, and her 2 trunks are somewhere in a drift. I have given her the blue room." Cade looked up from his papers. He was 34 at the time, and the look he wore whenever Grandmother began a sentence with, "There is a young woman," had become, over the years, something close to an art form. It was not unkind. It was simply the look of a man bracing for a siege. "Is she all right?" he said. "She is cold and she is proud and she has not complained once, which tells me everything I need to know about her," Grandmother said, and sat down in her chair by the fire as if the matter were concluded. "I'll have Ferris arrange supper in her room," Cade said, and looked back at his papers. "You will do no such thing," Grandmother said. "She will dine with us." I watched my brother set down his pen with the deliberateness of a man choosing his ground. "Grandmother, the woman is a stranger. She is likely exhausted. The kindest thing." "The kindest thing," Grandmother said, "is exactly what I am arranging. Her name is Miss Wren Calloway. Her father was Calloway of Ashfield, who died in the autumn owing rather a great deal to rather a great many people. She has no mother, one distant uncle in Perth who has declined to involve himself, and she is traveling to a position as a lady's companion in Inverness, which she will reach when the road is passable, which will not be soon." She folded her hands. "I have also taken the liberty of writing to her prospective employer to say that she has been delayed by weather and will arrive when conditions allow. So, dinner is at 8. Cade looked at me. I looked at the fire. I had learned very early that looking at the fire during one of Grandmother's announcements was the safest response available. "You wrote to her employer," Cade said. "On estate stationery," Grandmother said serenely. "It carries more weight." My brother picked up his pen again. This, I knew, did not mean he had capitulated. It meant he was deciding whether to fight the first engagement or wait for a better position. In the end he said, "She is welcome to dine with us. She is a guest and will be treated as one. But I will not have her made to feel observed, Grandmother. She is not a specimen." No, grandmother agreed. She is a young woman with a great deal of sense and no one in the world looking after her, which is a condition I have always found intolerable. She rose from her chair. 8 o'clock. Wear your good coat, not the gray one, the blue. She left. I waited until her footsteps had faded down the hall before I looked at my brother. She's scheming, I said. She is always scheming, Cade said. The question is only the shape of it. He was right, of course. But neither of us knew yet what shape this one would take. Miss Wren Calloway came down to dinner at 5 minutes to 8 in a dress that was clean and carefully pressed, and had been mended at the left sleeve with such fine stitching you would only notice it if you were looking, which I was, because I was curious, and because grandmother had seated me across from her where I could watch without being obvious about it. She was not what I expected, though I could not have said what I did expect. She was slight and dark-haired, with a face that was not striking at first and then, once she began to talk, became entirely impossible to look away from. It was a quick face, the kind that moved before the words came. Cade had worn the blue coat. I noticed that too. Grandmother made the introductions with all the warmth of a woman welcoming family, which was either generous or tactical depending on your interpretation, and I suspected it was both. Miss Calloway thanked her for her hospitality with a directness that was not gushing and not stiff, simply honest, the way a person thanks someone when they mean it and don't feel the need to dress it up. Then she sat down, unfolded her napkin, and looked at my brother across the table. "Your Grace," she said, "I want to thank you as well. I understand this is your house and not your grandmother's, and that she is perhaps more generous with invitations than you might have been yourself." There was a silence. I watched Cade's expression move through at least 3 things in quick succession, none of which he let reach his face entirely. Then he said, "You are welcome here, Miss Calloway. The road is impassable in any case. There is nowhere else to go." "That is a practical welcome," she said without heat, "but a welcome nonetheless, thank you." She picked up her soup spoon and began to eat, and I thought, oh, this is going to be interesting. Cade was not rude to her. That should be said clearly. My brother had a reputation in Edinburgh and in London for coldness, for the flat gaze that could silence a room, for the way he moved through society as though he were tolerating it on behalf of some prior arrangement. But he was never rude to guests in his house, and he was not rude now. He was measured. He answered her questions about the estate with the same quiet precision he brought to everything. He asked her once about the road conditions when she'd lost the wheel, and listened to her answer with real attention. But there was a wall in him, as there always was with Cade when he suspected an agenda, and it made the dinner feel like 2 people across a chessboard, each one watching the other's hands. It was grandmother who was warm and easy and drew Miss Calloway into conversation about Edinburgh, about books she had read, about the habits of late winter in the Highlands. And it was Miss Calloway who surprised me, not by being clever, which I had gathered from the first 5 minutes, but by being genuinely interested. She leaned forward when grandmother talked. She asked questions that were not polite filler but real ones, the kind you ask when you actually want to know the answer. By the end of the soup course, grandmother was talking about the loch and the old legend that attended it, some story about a clan long gone and an oath made on the ice, and Miss Calloway was listening with her chin resting lightly on her folded hands and her eyes very bright, and even Cade had stopped watching her as though she were a piece in a game and was simply watching her. After dinner, grandmother announced she was tired and took herself off to bed at a time that was frankly theatrical in its convenience, leaving me, my brother, and Miss Calloway in the drawing room with the fire and a pot of tea. I made a great business of remembering a letter I had to write and excused myself, and I confess I went only as far as the hall, because I am not, in the end, better than any of my instincts. What I heard was not a revelation. There was no grand exchange. Cade offered her tea. She thanked him. There was a pause long enough that I thought perhaps I had miscalculated and they were simply sitting in the silence that strangers sometimes share when they are too tired to manufacture conversation, and then she said, "You may set your mind at rest, Your Grace. I have no intentions here. I am passing through." "Miss Calloway, I mean no offense by it," she said, "but I could see at dinner that you were working something out, and I would rather name it plainly than pretend. I am a guest because the weather made me one. I will be gone when the road allows. You owe me nothing and I am asking for nothing. I have been a burden on people's charity before, and I have learned it goes better when the terms are stated plainly from the outset." Another silence. Then my brother said very quietly, "My grandmother wrote to your employer." "I know," she said. "I heard her dictating it to the secretary this afternoon. She told them I was her particular guest, which was kind and also entirely invented. I apologize for that." "Don't," she said. "She did it out of goodness, and it may save my position. I shall apologize to the lady in Inverness myself when I arrive and explain the circumstances. She seems from her letters to be a reasonable woman." A pause. "Your grandmother is quite remarkable." "She is," Cade said, and I could hear in his voice something that had not been there at dinner, a slight softening, the way a frozen thing begins just barely at the edge. "She has been remarkable my entire life, which is occasionally exhausting." Miss Calloway laughed. It was a short sound, unguarded, and I suspected she hadn't meant to let it out. "I imagine it is," she said. "Good night, Your Grace." "Good night, Miss Calloway." I retreated before she reached the hall. The snow continued for 3 more days. I will not pretend the snow was innocent. I have since wondered whether grandmother had some arrangement with the weather, some old compact struck on terms I am not privy to, because the blizzard that settled over Thornville in the second week of January was precisely calibrated to keep us indoors and in close quarters for exactly as long as was required. But I am getting ahead of myself. The morning after the dinner, Cade came down to find Miss Calloway in the library. She was not waiting for him. She was reading, she had found on her own, a volume of Scottish botanical illustrations from the previous century, and had it open on the reading table, and she was making notes in a small worn notebook she carried in her pocket. Cade told me this later, with the careful tone of a man reporting facts he has not yet decided what to make of. He had gone to the library for a surveyor's map, which was filed in the East Cabinet, and she was between him and the East Cabinet, and he could either ask her to move or navigate around her, and he navigated around her, and she did not look up except to say good morning. He found the map. He stood there for a moment. He said, "What are you noting?" She looked up then, and I imagined the expression on her face was the one it always had in those first days, clear-eyed and direct, without any of the flutter or the careful softness that women in that world were trained to bring out around men of Cade's rank. "The botanical names," she said. "Some of them have shifted since this was printed. The common name has held, but the Latin has been revised. I find that interesting." "You read Latin." "Enough for botanical nomenclature," she said. "My father had a library. I had the run of it from the time I was 8. She paused. "I hope you don't mind that I helped myself to the book. The housekeeper said the library was available to guests." "It is," Cade said. "Help yourself to whatever you need." He took his map and left. And then, again, he told me this himself, much later, in the way he had of narrating things flatly while feeling them acutely. He stood in the hallway outside the library for a moment and thought, "She reads Latin." It was not a thought with anywhere obvious to go, but it stayed with him, which says something, because Cade's mind was not in the habit of retaining things without a reason. That afternoon, grandmother organized a tea in the morning room, which she did approximately 3 times a week regardless of the season, and which she now organized with a supplementary guest who happened to be the only other person in the house under the age of 60. Cade came because grandmother expected it. Miss Calloway came because she had been invited and had no reason to refuse. I came because the fire in the morning room was better than the one in my room, and because I had given up pretending I was not fascinated. Grandmother had a gift for conversation that looked effortless and was in fact very carefully engineered. She moved topics the way a good driver moves the reins, with small precise adjustments that the horse never quite notices. That afternoon, she moved from the road conditions to the estate's history, to a question she asked Miss Calloway about her father's property at Ashfield and what had become of it in the settlement of his debts. Miss Calloway answered without hesitation and without the shame she might have been forgiven for carrying. Most of it went to the primary creditor, she said. The library went separately in pieces to several book dealers in Edinburgh. That was the hardest part, I think. The books were his most, they were very much him. She paused, took a sip of tea. It is done now, though. There is no use in sitting with it. No, grandmother agreed. There isn't, though it is permissible to grieve a thing before you're done with it. Miss Calloway looked at her. Something passed between them, not words, but something with the weight of words, and she said quietly, "He was a good man who made a series of very bad decisions. I loved him very much." Then she set her cup down. "The botanical gardens at Thornville, are they still maintained? The housekeeper mentioned there was a walled garden. I should like to see it when the snow lifts." Grandmother, who had engineered that pause and that admission with the precision of a surgeon, shifted the conversation to the gardens, and Cade, who had been sitting across the room with a posture that was almost convincingly indifferent, said, "The head gardener, Mac Phail, can show you. He has been managing the walled garden for 30 years. He will talk at considerable length about it if you let him." "I would like that," she said, and she looked at Cade when she said it, and there was a warmth in her voice that was not performance, and I saw my brother's shoulders just fractionally release. The second refusal came on the 5th day, which I know because I had begun keeping a private account of events in the back of my daybook, under the heading Grandmother's Campaign, because I am a man with time on my hands and an appreciation for history being made. There was a great deal to record. On the 3rd day, Cade had spent 40 minutes in the library discussing the revised Latin nomenclature in Grandmother's botanical volumes with Wren, and had come away with the look of a man who has unexpectedly enjoyed himself and is not sure how to account for it. On the 4th day, she had beaten him twice at chess in the drawing room. She had the patient, oblique style of a player who thinks 6 moves ahead and makes it look like she is thinking about something else entirely. And the second loss had drawn from my brother a short, surprised laugh, the kind that escapes before you can govern it, which I noted and dated carefully. He had asked her afterward where she had learned to play. She had said her father had taught her, and that she had spent the winter of her 15th year playing against herself, because there was no one else in the house who would give her a real game. "You played against yourself," he said. "Both sides seriously," she said. "It is quite instructive. You learn very quickly where your own weaknesses are when you're also the person trying to exploit them." He had looked at her for a moment with the chess pieces still in disarray between them, and then he had begun resetting the board and asked if she wanted to play again. They had stayed at it for another hour, and Grandmother, who had been sitting nearby with her needlework doing absolutely nothing of the kind, had eventually set it aside and gone to bed early and left the candles burning for them. The 5th day was when Grandmother first said it directly. She chose her moment as she always did, after supper, when the house was quiet, when Cade was in a good enough humor that she might catch him off guard. She waited until Miss Calloway had gone upstairs, and then she told Cade simply that she thought Miss Calloway would make an excellent Duchess of Thornville, and that it was her considered opinion, arrived at after 50 years of watching people, that if he let her leave for Inverness he would regret it. Cade put his glass down with a sound that was controlled but precise. "Grandmother." "I mean it," she said. "I am not being fanciful." "She is a stranger," he said. "She has been here 5 days. I have known the character of a person in 5 minutes, grandmother said, and I have known the wrong of a match in 5 years. 5 days is more than sufficient when one is paying attention. I cannot court a woman who is stranded in my house by a blizzard, he said. It would be. What? He stopped. He was looking for the word and could not find it, which was its own kind of answer. Unequal, he said at last. She is here because she has no choice. Any attention I showed her would carry a pressure she could not easily refuse. That is not a foundation. Grandmother looked at him for a long moment. That is the most honorable objection I have ever heard you raise, she said, and I would respect it entirely if I believed it was the real one. Cade stood up. Good night, grandmother. Good night, Cade, she said. Think about what I said. He didn't answer, but he thought about it. I knew he thought about it because I shared a wall with his bedchamber, and I could hear him moving at 2 in the morning, the slow back and forth of a man who cannot sleep and will not say why. What I did not know, until grandmother told me herself, a week later, was what she had said to Wren on the morning of the 5th day, before the evening exchange with Cade, before any of the supper. She had taken her tea with Wren alone in the morning room while Cade was with the estate steward, and she had said, without preamble and without apology, that she had brought her here with a purpose. Wren had looked at her across the tea tray. I suspected something of the sort, she said. Are you angry? Wren thought about this, genuinely thought about it, in that way she had, taking the question seriously enough that the answer meant something. Then she said, No, you didn't invent the blizzard and you couldn't have arranged the wheel to come off the coach on the lower pass. You saw an opportunity. I did, grandmother said. I have been looking for the right person for 4 years and I know her when I see her. I will not apologize for it. I'm not asking you to, Wren said. I am simply telling you that I know so that neither of us needs to pretend. She set her cup down. I should also tell you that whatever you intend, his decision is his own, and mine is my own. You may arrange proximity, but you cannot arrange feeling. Grandmother had smiled at this, a real smile, the private one she reserved for things that confirmed her best hopes. No, she said. That part is already arranged. I simply needed the weather to cooperate. She had told me this story, I think, because she wanted me to understand that it was not a scheme Wren had been blind to, but one she had walked into with open eyes and decided, for her own reasons, not to walk back out of. That mattered to grandmother. She was not, at her core, a manipulator. She was a woman who saw clearly what other people needed and arranged the conditions under which they might discover it themselves, which is a different thing, though the line between them is narrow enough that you must pay attention. She stayed for herself, grandmother told me, not for the house or the title or even for Cade. She stayed because she was lonely and because she found here something she hadn't had in a long time, which was people who made her feel that her presence was welcome and not merely useful. She paused. That is what I gave her first. The rest was always his to give or not. The third refusal happened because of me, which I will own with full transparency and no apology. On the 7th day, the snow had slowed to a thin scatter, and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees, and Miss Calloway had requested, and received, permission to visit the walled garden even in the cold, on the grounds that the snow-covered shapes of the dormant plants were in their own way more legible than the living ones, and that Mac Phail had agreed to accompany her with a wool blanket and a flask of tea. I happened to pass through the kitchen courtyard while they were out there, and I stopped and watched for a moment through the archway. She was standing in the center of the dormant garden in her good coat with her notebook open, and Mac Phail was explaining something with his hands, sketching the shape of a plant in the air, and she was nodding and writing and asking questions I could not hear. The cold had put color in her face, and the light off the snow made everything very clean and bright, and she was smiling at something the old gardener said, and it was not a polite smile. It was a real one, the kind that gets into the eyes and stays there, and I stood very still in the arch of the gate because I did not want to break whatever the moment was. I thought, she is the sort of person who makes every other person feel that what they know matters. That is a rarer gift than Latin, and it is a rarer gift than beauty, and it is almost impossible to manufacture, which means it is simply who she is. I found Cade in the estate office and I said, without thinking it through as carefully as I probably should have, "You ought to go to the garden." He looked up. "Why?" "Because she is out there," I said, "talking to Mac Fail, and he has not talked to anyone about those plants since his wife died 4 years ago, and she is making him feel that every word of it is important, which it is, and you should see it." Cade looked at me for a long time. "Rupert," he said, my name, which he used rarely and always with a particular weight, "I know what you are doing." "I am telling you something true," I said. "What you do with it is your own business." He did not go to the garden. He went back to his papers and I went back to my daybook and wrote, "Third refusal. Self-inflicted. The man is fighting himself as much as anything else, which has always been his way, and will break the same way it always does, slowly, and then all at once." What I did not foresee was the fire. It began in the hay store at the north end of the stable block. Old hay in a cold snap, a lamp left too close, a stable lad gone in from the cold without thinking. It was 9 o'clock in the evening and the house was winding down for the night, and the alarm came as a shout from the yard, and then another, and by the time Cade and I reached the stable door the far end of the loft was burning. What happened next I will tell you plainly, because it deserves to be told without decoration. Cade had already gone in. He was the Duke, and it was his house, and that was simply what he did, without deliberation, which is one of the things I have always respected about him when it did not terrify me. The grooms were working the nearest horses out, and there were 2 in the far stalls that were panicking, and the stable lad who had left the lamp was 12 years old and had gone back in after one of them, which was either brave or foolish, and at 12 years old is probably both. Miss Calloway came from the house behind me. She had a pail of water from the kitchen garden butt, and she used it on the burning edge of the stall partition without being asked, and then she went into the far stall where the boy was struggling with the second horse. I do not know what she said to either of them. I know that 2 minutes later the horse came out with the boy behind it, and that she was the last one through the door, and that her sleeve was burned at the cuff where the beam above the stall had thrown a spray of embers. Cade had not seen her go in. He had been at the other end of the block with the first horse. He came around the corner of the stable door, and found her standing in the yard with the boy beside her, and the second horse blowing steam into the cold air, and his face did something that I have thought about many times since. It was not relief, though there was relief in it. It was not anger, though there was something of that too. It was something older and quieter than either of those, the face of a man who has just understood that something has been real for longer than he knew. He crossed the yard. He took her wrist, the burned one, very carefully, and held it up to look at in the lamplight, and he said, "How bad is it?" "It's nothing," she said. "A graze. The cuff took most of it." "Come inside," he said. "The boy." "I'll see to the boy," I said, from 3 feet away, where I had been standing long enough that neither of them had registered my presence, which told me everything about the state of their attention. "Go inside, Wren." She looked at me. There was briefly a surprised expression on her face, not at the familiarity of the name, but at being managed, which was something she was clearly unaccustomed to and not certain she approved of. Then she let Cade lead her by the elbow toward the house. I looked after the boy and the horse. It took the better part of an hour, and I did not rush it. When I came in, the house was quiet. Grandmother was awake in the corridor outside the drawing room, sitting in a chair she had brought from the hall, a shawl around her shoulders, quite evidently waiting. "Well," she said. "The stable lad is fine," I said. "The horses are fine. The hay store is a loss. The stall partition can be rebuilt." "And Cade?" "He is in the drawing room," I said, "with Miss Calloway, and the door is open and the fire is up, and I am going to bed." Grandmother nodded. Then she reached up and patted my hand once with the matter-of-fact tenderness she had always had and said, "Good boy," which she had not said to me since I was 8, and which landed with a force entirely disproportionate to its size. I went upstairs. I wrote in my daybook, "The fire will do what 5 days of snow and 2 suppers and 100 small moments could not force," not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. I learned later from Cade himself, months after, when it was all settled and he had the ease of a man who has stopped fighting the thing he wanted, what passed between them in the drawing room that night. He had tended her wrist with the kit kept in the hall cabinet. She had sat still for it, which he said was characteristic of her, the capacity to accept help without making it into a production. He had asked her while he worked whether she had been afraid in the stable. She thought about it, then she said, briefly, when the beam above me cracked, "But the boy needed the horse calmed, and I know horses, so I wasn't afraid for long enough for it to matter." "You know horses," he said. "My father kept them," she said. "It was one of the debts, actually. He loved horses beyond his means, which is the kind of thing that is very charming in a father and very ruinous in an estate." She paused. "I don't say that bitterly. I know how it sounds, but I genuinely don't mean it bitterly." "I know," he said. "How do you know?" He looked at her, and he told me later that it was the question that caught him, the plain directness of it, the absence of any invitation for a compliment or a softening. She simply wanted to know. He said, "Because you've had 4 or 5 opportunities this week to speak of your father with resentment, and you haven't taken a single one." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He was not a practical man, he was a tender one. I would rather have had a tender father than a practical one." Cade wrapped the bandage. He did not speak immediately. She was about to say something else when he said, "My father was neither, he was simply absent." He said it without self-pity, with the same flatness he brought to everything, but it was a confidence, and he never offered those easily, and she seemed to understand that because she didn't respond to it with sympathy or comfort, only a slight nod, which was exactly the right response, and he noticed that it was the right response. "Miss Calloway," he said. "Wren," she said, "I think we've passed the point of Miss Calloway." "Wren," he said, and the words sat in the air between them for a moment. I find that he stopped, tried again. "I have treated you this week as a problem to be managed. I want to tell you that I know I have done that and I regret it." She looked at him. "You have treated me as an unexpected guest in your house during a difficult season," she said. "You have been courteous and you have set a good table and you have not once made me feel that my presence was a burden, even when your grandmother was clearly making my presence a campaign." She paused. "That is not nothing, Your Grace. That is rather a great deal." He was still looking at her. She met his eyes without looking away, which, he told me, was not an act of courage on her part but simply her nature. She looked at things straight on because she didn't know how to do it any other way. And he thought, sitting there with her bandaged wrist in his hands and the fire behind her and the quiet house around them, I have been very stupid. Not about her exactly. About himself. About what he had been doing for the last 7 days, which was finding reasons to be in the same room with her, and then finding reasons to be wary of her, and then finding reasons again to stand near her, and telling himself all of it was circumstance, when it was nothing of the sort. He let go of her wrist. He said, "Good night, Wren." "Good night, Cade," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name, and she used it the way she used everything, plainly, without fuss, as though it were simply what he was. He told me, when he told me all of this, that he sat in the drawing room alone for another hour after she went upstairs, and that at no point during that hour did he think about anything other than her. The road opened on the 12th day. A rider came up from Glenruin in the morning with word that the lower pass had been cleared enough for a careful coach, and that the weather was set fair for the next 3 days. The estate coach was harnessed by midday, and by 2 o'clock it stood in the front courtyard with Miss Calloway's 2 trunks loaded, and her bandaged wrist in a fresh wrapping that she had done herself. I watched from the library window, because I did not trust myself at the door not to say something that would embarrass my brother. Grandmother was at the door. She had embraced Miss Calloway with a warmth that was not in the least performative, and they had stood together for a moment talking quietly, and I could see from the slight bow of grandmother's head that she was saying something serious. Miss Calloway nodded once, and then took her hand and pressed it, and they were simply 2 women saying goodbye, and it was one of the most affecting things I had seen in years. Cade was not at the door. I had looked for him and he was not there. He was in the estate office with the door closed, which is what he did when he was thinking about something he did not want to be seen thinking about, and I thought, "Oh, you tremendous fool," and then I thought, "Give him a moment." The coachman climbed up to the box. Grandmother stepped back. Miss Calloway turned to look once at the house, not at any particular window, just at the house, the way you look at a place you are leaving and have mixed feelings about, and then she turned to the coach and put her hand on the door. I heard the estate office door open. I did not have to look. I heard his footsteps in the hall, and then the front door, and then the crunch of his boots on the stone of the courtyard, and I moved to the window. He came out into the cold without a coat. I noticed this, the absence of the coat, which for my brother was the equivalent of arriving disheveled, and he crossed the courtyard at a pace that was not quite a walk. Miss Calloway had turned. She was standing with her hand on the coach door, and she was watching him come toward her with the expression of a woman who is being careful not to assume anything. He stopped in front of her. He was close enough that I could see his breath in the cold air. He said something I could not hear through the glass. She tilted her head, that small, precise movement she made when she was listening with her full attention. She said something back. He said something else longer, and I watched his face through the glass, and it was the most unguarded I had ever seen it, the fortifications all down, and it was the face of a man who has made a decision he should have made a week ago and knows it, and is saying so without flinching. I found out later from Cade what he had said. He had said, "I have given you 12 reasons since you arrived why this cannot be anything, and I have believed none of them, and I would like to stop. I would like, if you are willing, to write to you. I would like to come to Inverness in the spring when you are settled, with a proper introduction and a proper occasion, and I would like to begin again from a foundation that doesn't involve a blizzard and my grandmother's management of the weather." He had said, "I am aware that is an extraordinary thing to ask of a woman who has every reason to think me cold and dismissive." He had said, "I know that. I am asking anyway." She was quiet for a moment after he finished. She looked at him with that clear, straight gaze she had from the start, and I thought she was going to say something cautious, something sensible, something that accounted for the shortness of the time and the strangeness of the circumstances, because she was the most clear-eyed person I had encountered in years, and clear-eyed people make sensible calculations. But she didn't. She said, and this too I had from Cade, repeated back to me with the care of a man who has memorized something because he cannot afford to lose it, she said, "You are not cold. You are very careful. They are not the same thing, and I think people confuse them in you because it is easier than paying attention. I have been paying attention," she said. "I don't want to go to Inverness." She said, "I would rather stay here if the invitation is genuine and not another one of your grandmother's arrangements." He said very quietly, "It is mine." And then she lifted her unbandaged hand and placed it, flat-palmed briefly, against his chest. And it was such a simple gesture, so entirely without drama, that it landed harder than any other gesture could have. He turned to the coachman and said something to him. The coachman nodded, unhurried, the nod of a man who has worked for this family a long time and has seen things, and began, methodically, to see about the trunks. Grandmother, in the doorway, let out a breath I could hear from the library window. Then she turned and walked directly to the morning room, where she sat down in her chair by the fire and, I later learned, had a private and thorough cry, which she would have denied with her dying breath if you had asked her about it. I went downstairs. I came out into the courtyard as the coachman was carrying the second trunk back inside, and Cade and Miss Calloway were standing together near the stone balustrade at the edge of the courtyard, where the ground fell away toward the lock. They were talking, just talking, but with the ease of two people who have been finding their way to this conversation for 12 days, and they both looked up when I came out. Miss Calloway, Wren, looked at me with an expression that was composed of roughly equal parts warmth and dry amusement, and she said, "Your brother tells me you have been keeping a written account of the past 12 days. I looked at Cade. He met my eyes with the calm of a man who has nothing left to hide. Did he? He said you called it grandmother's campaign. I will be burning that daybook, I said. Don't, she said. Someone should have kept the record. I stood in the cold courtyard with the light off the frozen lock making everything very bright and very still, and I said, "Are you staying then?" She considered this. She looked at Cade, and Cade looked back at her with an expression I had seen on his face exactly once before, when he was 19 and standing on a cliff above the sea, and someone had told him the world was very large. A look of something so close to wonder that it sat strange on his features, but honestly. "For a while," she said, "and then we will see." It turned out to be a very long while. Let me tell you how it went, because the 12 days at Thornville were the beginning, not the end, and the end is the part worth telling. Grandmother had been right. She was always right, which was, as Cade had said, occasionally exhausting. But she was right about Wren in ways that took the rest of the winter and most of the spring to become fully visible. Not to me, and not to grandmother, who had seen it in the first 20 minutes, but to Cade, who needed to discover things for himself, always in his own order because he was that kind of man, and who discovered each layer of her the way you discover the floors of a house, not all at once, but room by room, and with growing astonishment at what is there. She stayed at Thornville as grandmother's guest, which was proper enough, and she wrote to the lady in Inverness, and explained with full honesty that she would not be coming to the position, and sent with the letter a bank draft drawn on the Duke of Thornville's account for the inconvenience caused, which Cade had arranged, and which Wren had initially refused firmly, until Cade pointed out with equal firmness that the position had gone unfilled because of circumstances arising from his grandmother's management of events, and that the responsibility was therefore, at least in part, his, and that the Duchess, he had used the word quietly, deliberately, watching her face when he did, the Duchess of Thornville did not arrive in Inverness seeking work. She had looked at him for a long moment after that. Then she said, "You are very sure of yourself." "No," he said, and the honesty of it surprised them both. "I am very sure of you." They were engaged by March, not in the way of arranged things, not formally negotiated, but in the way of two people who have arrived at the same place from different directions and found, looking around, that it is where they intended to be. He asked her not in a drawing room or at a dinner table but in the walled garden in the early morning, when Mac Phail had unlocked the gate, and the first snowdrops were up at the edges of the beds, and Wren was crouched over them with her notebook, and Cade had come to find her because he had something to say and had decided that the time for waiting was done. She said yes without a long deliberation, which might have surprised anyone who didn't know her, but which I could have predicted, because Wren Calloway did not deliberate about things she was already certain of. She had been certain of him, I think, since the drawing room after the fire, though she was too clear-eyed to have said so until it was safe to. Grandmother wept again at the news. She denied this as well. The marriage was in May, at the church in Glenrowan, small and stone and very old, with the hillside behind it still brown at the edges and the first green coming through. It was not a great society wedding. It was not intended to be. The only guests were myself, grandmother, Mac Phail, who was given a place in the front pew on grandmother's firm instruction, the estate staff who had witnessed the whole winter of it, and a handful of Cade's oldest friends who came because they could not believe he had finally done something that made sense. Wren wore a cream silk that grandmother had pressed on her, with the simple observation that a woman married once and should not regret the dress, and her hair was up with 2 pins holding it, and the snowdrops from the walled garden threaded through it at Mac Phail's insistence. She walked in on my arm. Her uncle in Perth had declined the invitation, which was perhaps the most useful thing he had ever done for her, because it meant she walked with me and not a stranger, and I was glad of it. Cade was waiting at the front of the church. He was wearing the blue coat, which was not accidental. When she came down the aisle, he looked at her the way he had looked at her in the courtyard, all the fortifications gone, nothing managed, nothing held back, and she walked toward him with her chin up and her eyes on his face, clear and steady, and she was the least frightened person in the building, which I think was one of the things he loved most about her. The ceremony was brief. Afterward, outside in the May light, while the others were talking and the church bells were going, and someone had found reason to let off something loud in the direction of the lock, grandmother came to stand beside me. "You're going to say you knew," I said. "I did know," she said. "From the first 20 minutes. From before she sat down," she said. "From the way she thanked me when I offered her shelter. She looked me straight in the eye and meant it, and she did not ask for anything more than what I had offered." She paused. "That is not a common thing, Rupert. In my experience, that particular combination of dignity and honesty is very rare, and it is exactly what he needs, and I have been looking for it for 4 years." I thought about this. Then I said, "He refused 3 times. "He refused 3 times in words," she said, "and not once in practice. He could not stay away from her. Every refusal was an excuse to be in the same room discussing why he should not be in the same room." She looked over at where Cade and Wren were standing together in the church porch, heads bent toward each other, talking, as though the rest of the day could wait. He was not refusing her. He was refusing the idea that anything good could arrive so quickly and without preparation. "Your brother has always needed time to trust that the ground will hold." I did not say anything. There was nothing to add to that. She patted my arm. "Now go and find the champagne, dear. Mac Phail has hidden it somewhere sensible, and that means it will be very cold." I went to find the champagne. There is one more piece of this story that I want to tell you, because it is the piece Cade himself would not tell, being the kind of man who does not narrate his own epiphanies. On the evening of the wedding, after the small supper at Thornville, and after the staff had drifted away, and grandmother had gone upstairs with the serenity of a woman whose work is entirely complete, I found myself in the library alone with the fire going low. I was sitting where Cade had sat on the 14th of January when grandmother had come in to announce a young woman in the servants' corridor, and I was thinking about that, about how little a person can see ahead of them when they're in the middle of it. Cade came in, not for anything in particular. He'd seen the light under the door and come in the way brothers do, because the room held good company. He sat down in the other chair. He was still in the blue coat. He looked, for the first time in as long as I could remember, like a man who has put down something he has been carrying for a very long time. "Well," I said. "Well," he said. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire between us. Then he said, "She told me this morning that she had known, during those 12 days, what grandmother was doing." "Had she?" "From the second evening," he said. "She told me she decided to stay anyway, not because of grandmother's scheme, not because of the position in Inverness, and not because of the house or the title or any of it, but because she had never in her adult life been in a house where someone looked after her, and she wanted a few more days of it before she went back to the world." He paused. "She meant grandmother when she said that." "She meant grandmother," I agreed, "and possibly also the walled garden." He smiled, which on Cade's face was always a particular event, like good light on a difficult landscape. "The walled garden," he said. "Yes, possibly also that." I asked him, and I asked because I genuinely wanted to know, and because we were brothers, and because the fire was low and the house was quiet, and he was in the disposition of a man who would answer. "When did you know? Truly know?" He thought about it the way he thought about all things, with the seriousness they deserved. Then he said, "In the stable yard, when I came around the corner and she was standing there with the boy beside her and the horse behind her, and her sleeve was burned, and she was asking whether the horse was all right before she asked whether she was." He was quiet for a moment. "I had known before that, I think, but that is when I stopped being able to tell myself I didn't." We sat until the fire went fully out. Then we said good night and went our separate ways down the dark hall of Thornville, which was the house where our grandfather had lived and our father had not much liked, and which Cade had always loved in his steady, private way, and which would now be, for the first time in a long time, fully alive with someone in it who deserved to be there. I want to tell you one last thing, because it is the thing I think of when I think of all of it. 3 years after the wedding, I came to Thornville in autumn, which by then I did regularly, because the house had become the sort of house you want to return to, warm in a way that has nothing to do with the fireplaces, full of the ordinary noise of a life being well lived. MacPhail's garden was at its best in October, and grandmother, who was by then 81 and had shown no interest in slowing down, held court every afternoon in the morning room with the fire up and the tea strong, and usually at least 2 other people in the chairs she had placed for exactly this purpose. On the second afternoon of my visit, I went to the walled garden to see MacPhail about a planting question I had for my own small garden in Edinburgh. I found the gate open and MacPhail at the far end on his knees at the border, and sitting on the stone bench in the center of the garden, with a book open in her lap, and her face turned up toward the thin autumn light, was Wren. She looked up when she heard the gate. She was wearing one of Cade's coats over her own. It was too large for her, and she wore it the way she wore everything that was too large or too small for the circumstances she found herself in, which was to say entirely without self-consciousness, with the ease of a person who has long since stopped needing the world to fit her precisely. "Rupert," she said, "come and sit. MacPhail won't be ready to talk for another 10 minutes. He's at the autumn bulbs." I went and sat on the other end of the bench. The light was gold, and the garden smelled of late roses and cold earth, and the very particular stillness of a place that is loved and cared for. "How are you?" I said. "Very well," she said, with the simplicity she had always brought to that question, as though it were a fact and not a courtesy. Then she said, "He's in the estate office if you want him. He's been there since breakfast, which means he has found something in the accounts that wants explaining, and he will not stop until he has explained it." "That is entirely consistent," I said. She smiled. It was the same smile she had in the first days, that unguarded, quick thing that got into the eyes. "It is," she said. "I have come to find it very comforting, actually. The absolute certainty that when something wants understanding, he will sit with it until he understands it." She looked back at her book. "It turns out to be a quality with very broad application." I understood what she meant. I understood it precisely. I sat with her in the garden until MacPhail was ready, and then I asked my questions about bulbs and got a great deal more information than I had anticipated. And afterward, I walked back through the house and stopped in the hall outside the estate office, where the door was ajar, and I could see my brother at his desk with his head bent over his papers, and the look on his face that meant full concentration, the look he had had since childhood. Before the dukedom and the responsibilities, and all the accumulated weight of being the sort of man the world decided needed to be feared. I stood there for a moment, then I walked on. I wrote in my daybook that evening, under the entry from January, which I had never burned. He sat with it until he understood it. She was right. It turns out to be a quality with very broad application. Grandmother Marin would have called it simply good sense. She would have been right, as she almost always was. And if she had known I wrote any of this down, she would have pointed out crisply that the whole affair had never been complicated, that she had seen it in the first 20 minutes, that the 3 refusals were simply his way of arriving at the inevitable, and that the champagne, in the end, had not been as cold as it should have been, which was Mac Phail's fault, and that next time someone should tell him the church porch faces south. I would have agreed with all of it. And then I would have gone to find the champagne, because that is what you do when the people you love have found each other at last, and the fire is good, and the house around you is warm, and the ground, finally, is holding.